Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the immaculate lawn of Rosehaven Manor, where the annual St. Mary Mead Garden Party was in full swing. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had outdone herself this year, with striped marquees dotting the grounds like festive mushrooms, and tables groaning under the weight of cucumber sandwiches, Victoria sponges, and her famous strawberry tarts. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a flowering cherry tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, as she worked on what appeared to be yet another pair of mittens for her great-nephew. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her wool, occasionally pausing to adjust her spectacles or smooth a stray silver curl beneath her sensible hat. In truth, she was thoroughly enjoying the afternoon's entertainment. Not the croquet match or the raffle, but the far more fascinating spectacle of human nature on display. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," chirped Mrs. Bantry, sweeping toward her in a summer frock that was perhaps a shade too young for her 65 years. "I do hope you're enjoying yourself. The weather has been simply perfect, hasn't it?" "Indeed, Mrs. Bantry, your garden looks magnificent this year." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled with gentle warmth. "I see young Timothy Hartwell has won the three-legged race again. 3rd year running, I believe. Oh, yes, that boy could win a race with one leg tied behind his back." Mrs. Bantry laughed, then caught herself. "I mean, well, you know what I mean. His mother Clara is over there by the tea tent, looking rather peaked, poor thing. She's been having such a difficult time since her husband's business troubles began." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Business troubles? Oh, nothing too serious, I'm sure. Something about missing funds at the bank where he works. You know how these things get blown out of proportion." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Though, between you and me, Clara did mention they might have to let the housekeeper go." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion erupted near the refreshment tent. Raised voices carried across the lawn, causing heads to turn and conversations to falter. "I don't care what anyone says." The voice belonged to Mrs. Vera Ashford, the village postmistress, her normally composed demeanour cracking like thin ice. Some things cannot be forgiven, no matter how much time has passed. Facing her was Mr. Richard Fairchild, his weathered face flushed with indignation. At 73, he was one of the village's most respected residents, a retired solicitor, whose word carried considerable weight in local matters. "Mrs. Ashford, this is neither the time nor the place," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "When is the time, Mr. Fairchild? When is it ever the time? You think because it was 30 years ago, it doesn't matter any more. You think because everyone's forgotten—" "That's quite enough," interrupted Dr. Gerald Meadows, stepping between them with the practised ease of a man accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere, more private." Dr. Meadows was relatively new to St. Mary Mead, having taken over the practice only 2 years ago when old Dr. Pemberton retired. He was a man in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and prematurely greying, hair that suggested too many sleepless nights attending to patients. Mrs. Ashford's angry flush deepened. "Private? There's been enough privacy, enough secrets. The truth has a way of coming out, Doctor, whether we like it or not." With that, she turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving a wake of uncomfortable silence. The gathered crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in hushed, speculative tones. Miss Marple observed all this with the detached interest of a naturalist studying exotic birds. She noticed how Mr. Fairchild's hands trembled slightly as he smoothed his hair, how Dr. Meadows's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and how several other villagers, Mrs. Clara Hartwell among them, had gone quite pale during the exchange. "Well, I never," breathed Mrs. Bantry, fanning herself with her programme. "What on earth was that about? I've known Richard Fairchild for 30 years, and I've never seen him look so stricken." "People carry such burdens," Miss Marple murmured, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Sometimes the weight becomes too much to bear." The afternoon wore on, but the earlier commotion had cast a shadow over the festivities. Miss Marple noticed how groups formed and reformed, voices dropping whenever certain people passed by. She saw Mrs. Ashford standing alone by the rose garden, her face a mask of grim determination. Mr. Fairchild had sought refuge at a corner table with Colonel Smithers and Mr. George Weatherby, the bank manager, deep in what appeared to be an intense discussion. As the sun began to lower in the sky and the shadows grew longer, Mrs. Bantry called for the traditional group photograph. The villagers assembled on the manor's front steps, arranging themselves in rows with practised efficiency. Miss Marple, preferring to remain an observer, positioned herself to one side with her knitting. Through her viewfinder, the photographer called out his instructions. "Little to the left, Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Fairchild, could you move in a bit closer? That's lovely, everyone." The camera clicked just as a blood-curdling scream shattered the peaceful afternoon air. The sound came from the direction of the old summer house, partially hidden by a grove of apple trees at the far end of the garden. For a moment, everyone stood frozen, as if the camera had captured them in permanent tableau. Then chaos erupted. People ran toward the sound, Mrs. Bantry crying out in distress, Dr. Meadows pushing through the crowd with his medical bag already in hand. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the unfolding scene. They found Mrs. Ashford collapsed on the summer-house steps, her face white as parchment, pointing with a shaking finger toward the interior of the small building. Inside, slumped in a wicker chair with a teacup still balanced precariously on the armrest, was Mr. Richard Fairchild. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, but something about his stillness suggested this was a sleep from which he would never wake. Dr. Meadows knelt beside the chair, his trained fingers seeking a pulse, though his expression suggested he expected to find none. "Is he?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, though the question hung unfinished in the air. Dr. Meadows nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. We'll need to call the police immediately." As the villagers milled about in shock and confusion, Miss Marple stepped quietly into the summer house. Her keen eyes swept the scene, noting the half-eaten sandwich on the table, the newspaper folded open to the crossword puzzle, the slight disarray of papers that suggested Mr. Fairchild had been searching for something. Most interesting of all was the faint but unmistakable scent that lingered in the air. Not unpleasant, but definitely out of place in a summer house on Mount. A warm summer's afternoon. Heart attack, most likely, Dr. Meadows was explaining to the gathering crowd. At his age, with the stress he seemed to be under. But Miss Marple said nothing, merely tucked her knitting into her bag, and stepped back into the fading sunlight. She had a feeling that Mr. Richard Fairchild's death would prove to be anything but natural, and that Mrs. Ashford's angry words about truth and secrets would prove more prophetic than anyone imagined. The perfect garden party had taken a decidedly imperfect turn, and in the gathering dusk, St. Mary Mead suddenly felt like a very different place indeed. Chapter 2. Whispers and Theories. Within an hour, the tranquil grounds of Rosehaven Manor had transformed into something resembling a battlefield command post. Police constables had cordoned off the summer house with yellow tape, and Detective Inspector Craddock had arrived from Much Benham, his usually pristine uniform wilted from the hurried journey. Miss Marple had positioned herself on a garden bench, within earshot of the various conversations swirling around the gathered villagers. Mrs. Bantry, despite her earlier distress, had risen to the occasion and was providing tea to anyone who needed it, though her hands shook noticeably as she poured. "Terrible business, absolutely terrible," Colonel Smithers was saying to anyone who would listen. His military bearing couldn't quite hide the tremor in his voice. Known Richard for decades, sound as a pound, that man never showed any signs of heart trouble. "People don't always show signs," Dr. Meadows interjected, though he seemed uncomfortable with his own explanation. "Stress can be a silent killer, particularly in men of his age." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she observed the group dynamics. She noticed how Mrs. Clara Hartwell kept glancing nervously towards the summer house, how Mr. George Weatherby from the bank seemed to be avoiding eye contact with everyone, and how several villagers had unconsciously formed a protective circle around Mrs. Ashford, who sat pale and silent in a garden chair. "I still can't believe he's gone," whispered Mrs. Patterson, the vicar's wife, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "He seemed perfectly fine during the opening ceremony. Made quite a witty remark about my roses, actually." Young Inspector Craddock approached the group, his notebook at the ready. He was new to the district, having transferred from London only 6 months ago, and his city methods sometimes clashed with village sensibilities. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually," he announced, consulting his notes, "starting with whoever discovered the body." All eyes turned to Mrs. Ashford, who seemed to shrink further into her chair. I only went to the summer house because I needed a quiet moment. After the disagreement, I felt quite overwrought." About this disagreement, Inspector Craddock's pen poised over his notebook. "Several witnesses mentioned raised voices between you and the deceased. What was the nature of your dispute?" Mrs. Ashford's lips pressed into a thin line. "It was a private matter, Inspector. Something that happened many years ago." Mrs. Ashford, the inspector's voice took on a patient but firm tone. "In a case like this, very little remains private. I'll need details." Before Mrs. Ashford could respond, Mr. Weatherby stepped forward, his banker's instincts clearly warring with social propriety. "Inspector, perhaps I might have a word. There are certain financial matters that might be relevant." Miss Marple observed with interest how several people stiffened at this suggestion. Mrs. Hartwell's teacup rattled against its saucer, and Dr. Meadows suddenly found the garden's flower beds fascinating. "Financial matters?" Inspector Craddock's eyebrows rose. "What sort of financial matters?" "Well, it's somewhat delicate." Mr. Weatherby glanced around nervously. But there have been some irregularities at the bank. Nothing proven, you understand. But Mr. Fairchild had been asking questions, rather persistent questions. Colonel Smithers harumphed. George, surely you're not suggesting that Richard was involved in anything unseemly? The man was straight as an arrow. Oh, no, Mr. Weatherby hastened to clarify. Quite the opposite. He was helping us investigate certain discrepancies. As our former legal adviser, he still took a keen interest in the bank's affairs. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their knitting. This was indeed interesting. She glanced at Dr. Meadows, whose expression had grown decidedly uncomfortable. These discrepancies, Inspector Craddock pressed, do they involve significant amounts? Potentially, yes, though, as I said, nothing has been proven. Mr. Fairchild was quite convinced there was a pattern to the missing funds, but he hadn't yet identified. Mr. Weatherby stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he'd said too much in such a public setting. A new voice interrupted the conversation. Inspector Craddock, I'm Dr. Meadows. I examined the body initially, and I must say, while a heart attack seems the most likely cause, there are a few things that puzzle me. The inspector looked up sharply. Puzzle you? In what way? Dr. Meadows hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Well, Mr. Fairchild's colouring was unusual, not quite what I'd expect from cardiac arrest. And there was an odd smell in the summer house. I noticed that too, Miss Marple said quietly, surprising everyone. They'd almost forgotten she was there. Quite out of place for a garden summer house on a summer afternoon. Rather like bitter almonds, perhaps. Dr. Meadows stared at her with sudden intensity. Yes, exactly like bitter almonds. I couldn't quite place it at the time, but that's precisely what it was. Inspector Craddock's expression sharpened considerably. Doctor, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything definitive, Dr. Meadows replied carefully. But I believe a post-mortem examination would be advisable. A collective gasp went up from the assembled villagers. The implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. Murder? Mrs. Bantry whispered, her face gone white. You're talking about murder? We're talking about being thorough, Inspector Craddock said firmly. This is now officially a police investigation. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene, but her mind was racing. The bitter almond scent, the financial irregularities, the 30-year-old secrets that Mrs. Ashford had alluded to. The threads were beginning to form a pattern, though the full picture remained frustratingly elusive. I suppose we should all consider ourselves suspects then, Mr. Weatherby said with nervous laughter. Though I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm Richard. Can't you? Mrs. Ashford spoke for the first time since the inspector's arrival, her voice barely above a whisper. There are those who profit from silence, Mr. Weatherby. Those who have built their entire lives on foundations of lies. The banker's face flushed red. Now see here, Mrs. Ashford. Enough, Inspector Craddock intervened. I'll be speaking with each of you privately. In the meantime, I must ask that no one leaves the village without informing the police. The crowd began to disperse. Miss Marple noticed several interesting interactions. Mrs. Hartwell approached Dr. Meadows with what appeared to be an urgent question, though they were too far away for her to hear the conversation. Colonel Smithers and Mr. Weatherby fell into heated discussion near the rose bushes, their body language suggesting disagreement. Most intriguingly, Mrs. Ashford remained seated, staring at the summer-house with an expression that mixed grief, fear, and something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. 30 years, she murmured, whether to herself or to Miss Marple, who sat nearby. It was unclear. The 30 years I've waited for the truth to come out. Perhaps Richard's death will accomplish what his life couldn't. Miss Marple said nothing, but her knitting needles clicked a little faster. In her experience, when people spoke of truth after so many years of silence, it usually meant that particular truth was about to become very dangerous indeed. As the evening shadows lengthened across Rosehaven Manor's once peaceful gardens, it became clear that Mr. Richard Fairchild's death had opened a door that many in St. Mary Mead would have preferred to keep firmly closed. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Parlour. The following morning dawned grey and drizzling, as if the weather itself reflected the village's subdued mood. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and was tending to her garden when Mrs. Bantry appeared at her gate, looking decidedly frazzled. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry called out, her usual cheerfulness notably absent. "Might I have a word? I'm quite beside myself, and I simply don't know what to think." Miss Marple invited her in for tea, settling her guest in the cosy sitting room overlooking the garden. Mrs. Bantry's hands shook slightly as she accepted the delicate china cup. "It's this business with poor Richard," Mrs. Bantry began. "Inspector Craddock came to see me this morning. Such questions he asked about who had access to the summer-house, about the refreshments, about everyone's movements during the party. Naturally, he must be thorough," Miss Marple observed mildly, pouring milk into her own tea. "I imagine he's speaking with everyone who attended." "Yes, but that's not what's troubling me." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "He asked specifically about the tea service in the summer-house. Apparently, Richard had been served tea that wasn't meant for guests at all." Miss Marple's eyebrows raised slightly. "Oh? It was my own private blend, you see. Chinese tea that Arthur brought back from his travels years ago. Quite expensive and rather strong. I keep it in the kitchen for my personal use, never serve it to guests. But somehow Richard had a cup of it. How interesting! And who would have had access to your private tea?" Mrs. Bantry wrung her hands. "That's just it. Anyone who went through the kitchen during the afternoon. The caterers, of course, but also Clara Hartwell, who helped me arrange the flower displays in the morning. Mrs. Ashford brought some extra sugar from the post office. Even Dr. Meadows passed through when he came to use the telephone." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And this would have been before or after his disagreement with Mrs. Ashford? Before, I think. Yes, definitely before. He seemed quite relaxed then, even complimented my arrangements. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Craddock, looking somewhat harried. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have a moment. I understand you knew Mr. Fairchild quite well." "Please, do come in, Inspector. Mrs. Bantry and I were just discussing the tragic events." Inspector Craddock nodded to Mrs. Bantry, then settled into the offered chair with evident fatigue. "I've been making the rounds all morning, and I must say, the picture I'm getting is rather complex. Everyone speaks of Mr. Fairchild as a pillar of the community, yet it seems he'd been quite agitated lately." "Agitated?" Miss Marple prompted gently. According to several villagers, he'd been making inquiries about events that occurred 30 years ago, something involving the old bank manager's death. A Mr. Pemberton, I believe, Mrs. Bantry started. Oh my! You mean old Mr. Pemberton, who supposedly took his own life? But that was ruled suicide, Inspector. He left a note confessing to embezzling bank funds. Yes, so I've been told. But Mr. Fairchild apparently had doubts about that conclusion. He'd been asking questions, reviewing old documents. According to bank records, he'd requested access to files from that period just last week. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink. How very curious. And what did Mrs. Ashford mean yesterday when she spoke of things that couldn't be, forgiven after 30 years? Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. That's what I'm trying to determine. Mrs. Ashford was less than forthcoming when I interviewed her this morning. She insists their argument was about a private family matter, but refuses to elaborate. Family matter? Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. But Mrs. Ashford was never married. She's lived alone since she came to the village 35 years ago. 35 years, Miss Marple repeated slowly. That would place her arrival shortly before the Pemberton incident. Inspector Craddock nodded grimly. Precisely. And here's another interesting detail. The post-mortem results came in this morning. Dr. Meadows was right to be suspicious. Cyanide poisoning, almost certainly administered in the tea. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Cyanide! In my tea service! But how ghastly! The bitter almond scent you both noticed was indeed from cyanide, the inspector continued. What's particularly interesting is that the poison was added to that special Chinese tea Mrs. Bantry mentioned. The killer knew exactly which cup Mr. Fairchild would drink from. Miss Marple's needles, which had been clicking steadily, paused, suggesting either foreknowledge of Mr. Fairchild's preferences or perhaps an intimate knowledge of the household routines. Exactly. Inspector Craddock looked between the two women. Mrs. Bantry, you mentioned several people had access to your kitchen yesterday. I'll need a complete list. As Mrs. Bantry recounted the names, Miss Marple found herself thinking about patterns. Someone who knew the house well enough to distinguish between the regular tea service and Mrs. Bantry's private blend. Someone who knew Richard Fairchild would seek the quiet of the summer house for his afternoon tea. Someone who had lived in the village long enough to have secrets worth protecting. Inspector, Miss Marple said suddenly, I wonder if you might tell us more about the original Pemberton case. The details might be illuminating. Inspector Craddock hesitated. It was rather straightforward, according to the files. Harold Pemberton, the bank manager, was found dead in his locked office on a Sunday morning, ruled suicide by poison. He'd left a detailed confession admitting to systematic embezzlement over several years. And no one questioned this conclusion at the time. One person did. The young solicitor who handled the legal aspects of the case insisted the handwriting seemed wrong, that Pemberton had seemed in good spirits the week before his death. That solicitor was quite persistent in his concerns. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Who was this solicitor? A Mr. Richard Fairchild, recently qualified and eager to make his mark. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was working furiously. A young solicitor questioning a convenient suicide. An older, man still seeking truth 3 decades later, and financial irregularities at the same bank, bringing everything full circle. There's something else, Inspector Craddock added reluctantly. We found papers in Mr. Fairchild's coat pocket. Notes about the Pemberton case, but also about current financial discrepancies at the bank. He seemed to believe there was a connection. Bantry looked thoroughly confused. But, Inspector, how could there be a connection? Mr. Pemberton died 30 years ago. The people involved would be. She trailed off as understanding dawned in her eyes. The people involved would still be alive, Miss Marple finished quietly, still living in this village, still protecting their secrets. Inspector Craddock stood. I'm afraid I must ask both of you to keep this conversation confidential. We're dealing with a very clever murderer here, someone who has managed to keep secrets for 30 years. That suggests they might be willing to kill again to protect them. As the inspector left, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. My dear, what have we stumbled into? Miss Marple smiled serenely, though her eyes were sharp with thought. Something that was never truly buried, Mrs. Bantry. Something that has been festering beneath the surface of our peaceful village for far too long. Outside the window, the drizzle continued, and St. Mary Mead felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of old secrets was pressing down upon its cottages and gardens like the grey clouds overhead. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect by. Afternoon, news of the cyanide poisoning had spread through the village like ripples in a pond. Miss Marple found herself with an unusual number of callers, each seemingly desperate to share their theories about poor Mr. Fairchild's murder. Mrs. Patterson, the vicar's wife, arrived first, followed closely by Colonel Smithers. They settled in Miss Marple's sitting room with the awkward formality of people determined to discuss something unpleasant. It's simply dreadful, Mrs. Patterson began, dabbing at her eyes. To think that someone in our village, someone we see every day, could do such a thing. Colonel Smithers harumphed, his military moustache bristling with indignation. Mark my words, it's that Ashford woman. Always was a queer sort, never quite fit in properly. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, with mild interest. Whatever makes you say that, Colonel? Stands to reason, doesn't it? Public argument with Richard just hours before he dies? And all that cryptic talk about 30-year-old secrets? She's been harbouring some grudge all this time. Mrs. Patterson nodded reluctantly. I hate to speak ill of anyone, but Mrs. Ashford has always been intense, and she did seem almost pleased when she spoke about truth coming out. Besides, Colonel Smithers continued, warming to his theme, she would have had access to Mrs. Bantry's kitchen. I saw her there myself, carrying in sugar from her shop. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Yes, I believe several people were in and out of the kitchen. Dr. Meadows mentioned using the telephone there, didn't he? Quite right, the Colonel acknowledged. But he's a medical man, above suspicion surely. Same with Mrs. Hartwell. Poor woman's got enough troubles with her husband's business difficulties without adding murder to her concerns. What sort of business difficulties? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward conspiratorially. Timothy's position at the bank is rather precarious, I'm afraid. Something about irregularities in his department. George Weatherby mentioned it to the vicar in confidence, of course. Colonel Smithers shifted uncomfortably. Damned shame, if you ask me. Timothy's a good man, just perhaps not the most careful with figures. Nothing criminal, mind you. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Dr. Meadows, looking rather haggard. "Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion. I was wondering if I might have a brief word. In private, if possible." Colonel Smithers and Mrs. Patterson took the hint and departed, leaving Dr. Meadows alone with Miss Marple. He paced to the window, then turned back, clearly agitated. "Inspector Craddock has been asking some rather pointed questions about my movements yesterday. Seems someone saw me coming out of the summer house about 20 minutes before the photograph was taken." Miss Marple poured him tea without comment, waiting for him to continue. "The truth is, I did go there. I needed to make a private telephone call to my former colleague in London about Richard's symptoms. You see, I'd noticed something odd about his behaviour recently." "Odd in what way?" Dr. Meadows sat heavily. "He'd become increasingly anxious, complained of feeling watched, said he'd had his house searched while he was out, nothing taken, but things moved. I thought he might be developing paranoid tendencies, common enough in elderly gentlemen. But now you think differently. Now I think someone really was watching him, perhaps searching for something specific. Miss Marple, there's something else. When I examined Richard's body, I found this tucked in his waistcoat pocket." He handed her a small piece of paper. It, in Mr. Fairchild's careful handwriting, were the words, "The truth about 1994. Check the safety deposit box. Key behind the—" The note ended abruptly. Miss Marple studied the paper carefully. "Have you shown this to Inspector Craddock?" "No, yet. I wanted to think about it first. Miss Marple, I've heard the gossip about Mrs. Ashford. Everyone seems convinced she's the killer. But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this than meets the eye." "Why haven't you given this to the inspector?" Dr. Meadows looked uncomfortable. "Because I'm concerned about a rush to judgment. If Mrs. Ashford is arrested, the real killer might disappear completely. And frankly, I'm not certain she's physically capable of obtaining and administering cyanide with such precision." Before Miss Marple could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Clara Hartwell, looking even more distressed than usual. "Oh, Dr. Meadows, thank goodness you're here," she said breathlessly. "It's Mrs. Ashford. She's been taken ill, quite suddenly. Inspector Craddock is with her now, but she keeps asking for you." Dr. Meadows grabbed his medical bag. "What sort of illness?" "Violent stomach pains, difficulty breathing. She collapsed in her shop just after lunch." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Had she eaten anything unusual today? Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. "I don't think so. She had lunch at the Blue Boar with several other villagers. They all had the same meal, cottage pie and vegetables." As Dr. Meadows hurried out, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Hartwell lingering by the door, clearly wanting to say something but hesitating. "Was there something else, Mrs. Hartwell?" The younger woman twisted her handkerchief nervously. "Miss Marple, I need to tell someone, but I'm not sure who to trust. Yesterday morning, when I was helping Mrs. Bantry with the flowers, I saw something troubling." She paused, gathering courage. "I went to the kitchen for more vases, and I saw Mr. Weatherby at Mrs. Bantry's desk in the morning room. He was going through papers, searching for something. When he saw me, he looked guilty and mumbled something about looking for stationery. Did you mention this to Inspector Craddock?" "No. You see, George, Mr. Weatherby, has been so kind about Timothy's situation at the bank. He's trying to prevent any formal action being taken. I was afraid that if I said anything—" Miss Marple nodded understanding. "These are difficult times for you, my dear. But now, with poor Mr. Fairchild dead and Mrs. Ashford ill— Miss Marple, what if someone is systematically removing people who know something about those old bank records?" It was a chilling thought, and one that had occurred to Miss Marple as well. If Mrs. Ashford died, she would take whatever secrets she knew with her. And if she had been poisoned— "Mrs. Hartwell, I think you should tell Inspector Craddock about what you saw. Perhaps not immediately, but soon. These things have a way of becoming important." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, the note from Dr. Meadows still in her hand. Everyone seemed convinced that Mrs. Ashford was the killer, driven by some 30-year-old grievance. But as she had learned long ago, the most obvious suspect was often the most convenient, not necessarily the most guilty. If someone wanted to commit murder and escape suspicion, what better way than to create an obvious suspect, stage a public argument, ensure the suspect's movements were noticed, then strike while all eyes were on them? But now Mrs. Ashford was ill, coincidentally or otherwise. And somewhere in the village a killer was watching, waiting, perhaps planning their next move. Miss Marple reached for her telephone. It was time to have another conversation with Inspector Craddock before it was too late. Chapter 5. Hidden Clues. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within the hour, looking more frazzled than she had ever seen him. Dr. Meadows accompanied him, his medical bag still in hand. "Mrs. Ashford is stable for now," Dr. Meadows reported without preamble. "But I'm concerned. Her symptoms are consistent with a mild dose of the same substance that killed Mr. Fairchild." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "Cyanide?" "Possibly, though in much smaller quantities. If I'm right, someone wanted to incapacitate her, not kill her, at least not immediately." Inspector Craddock slumped into the offered chair. "This complicates matters considerably. If Mrs. Ashford was the killer, who would want to poison her now? And if she wasn't—" He left the thought unfinished. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "Dr. Meadows showed me something he found on Mr. Fairchild's person. Perhaps you should examine it." Reluctantly, Dr. Meadows handed over the note. Inspector Craddock read it twice, his expression growing grimmer. A safety deposit box. Key behind the— Behind the what? He looked up sharply. "Doctor, why didn't you present this evidence immediately?" "Because I wanted to ensure we weren't rushing to judgment about Mrs. Ashford. She's been unconscious most of the afternoon, hardly in a position to defend herself against accusations." Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "If I may, Inspector, there's something else you should know. Mrs. Hartwell witnessed Mr. Weatherby searching through papers in Mrs. Bantry's morning room yesterday. She related the conversation she'd had with Clara Hartwell, watching as Inspector Craddock's frown deepened. Papers at Mrs. Bantry's. But what could he have been looking for there? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm, something related to the incomplete note. Mr. Fairchild wrote, "Key behind the sir." Could he have hidden the safety deposit box key at Rosehaven Manor? Dr. Meadows looked startled. But why there, of all places? Mrs. Bantry mentioned that Mr. Fairchild had been a frequent visitor recently, helping with some legal matters regarding her late husband's estate. He would have had ample opportunity to conceal something there. Inspector Craddock stood abruptly. "We need to search that morning room. Doctor, I'll need you to stay with Mrs. Ashford. If someone tried to silence her once, I understand. I've already arranged for the constable to remain at her bedside." After they left, Miss Marple sat quietly for several minutes, pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind like fragments of a kaleidoscope. Then, with the decisiveness that had served her well in past mysteries, she put on her coat and hat and ventured out into the damp afternoon. Her first stop was the post office. The closed sign hung askew on the door, and Miss Marple could see the chaos inside where Mrs. Ashford had collapsed. But it wasn't the shop that interested her. It was the small flat above it where Mrs. Ashford lived. There was something about Mrs. Ashford's passionate declaration at the garden party that nagged at Miss Marple. 30 years I've waited for the truth to come out. The phrasing suggested active patience, not casual memory. Miss Marple had noticed during her years of observation that people who harboured secrets often kept reminders of them. Letters, photographs, documents, small talismans of unresolved business. The constable guarding the building recognised her, and after some gentle persuasion about ensuring Mrs. Ashford's plants were watered, allowed her inside. Mrs. Ashford's flat was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. Miss Marple moved through it slowly, not searching so much as absorbing. The bedroom was simple, single bed, wardrobe, dressing table. But on the dressing table was something interesting. A photograph of a young woman and a baby, circa 1960s, by the fashion and quality. The woman bore a faint resemblance to Mrs. Ashford, but softer, happier. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written Dorothy and Little James, 1964. Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. Mrs. Ashford's given name was Vera, not Dorothy. Yet she kept this photograph prominently displayed. Family. But according to village knowledge, Mrs. Ashford had no relations. In the sitting room, Miss Marple found Mrs. Ashford's desk, an old-fashioned roll-top affair. Most drawers were locked, but one had been left slightly ajar. Inside, Miss Marple discovered a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings, all relating to the same story. Local bank manager found dead. Pemberton suicide leaves questions. And oddly, young mother dies in car accident. The last clipping was dated 3 weeks after Mr. Pemberton's death. The photograph showed the same young woman from the bedroom picture. The caption read, Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, 26, died when her car veered off the road near Bridgewhistle. She is survived by infant son James Pemberton. Miss Marple sat back, the pieces clicking into place. Dorothy Pemberton, Harold Pemberton's daughter-in-law, and little James would be Harold's grandson. But what had happened to the child after his mother's death? A sound from downstairs made her quickly replace the clippings and photograph. She had gathered enough information for now. Her next stop was the Blue Boar, where Mrs. Ashford had taken her last meal. The proprietor, Mr. Davies, was happy to discuss the incident. Terrible thing, Miss Marple. Mrs. Ashford seemed perfectly fine during lunch. Even had seconds of my cottage pie, which isn't like her, usually picks at her food. She does. Did she dine alone? Oh, no. She was with the usual Tuesday lunch group. Mrs. Patterson, Colin Smithers, Mr. Weatherby, and young Dr. Meadows. They all had the same meal. Mr. Davies paused, frowning. Though come to think of it, Mrs. Ashford did seem a bit distracted, kept checking her watch, looking toward the door, as if she was expecting someone. Aye, that's exactly it. And about halfway through the meal, someone did stop by her table. Mr. Fairchild it was, just popped his head in to say hello, didn't stay but a moment. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Mr. Fairchild? But he was already dead by then, surely. Mr. Davies looked confused. Dead? No, miss. This was yesterday morning, before the garden party. Mr. Fairchild stopped in around noon, just before they served lunch. The implications hit Miss Marple like a physical blow. If Mr. Fairchild had spoken to Mrs. Ashford at lunch, on the day he died, their public argument later might have been staged, a performance designed to deflect suspicion. But from whom? And why had Mrs. Ashford been poisoned? To silence her permanently, or to remove her as a suspect by making her appear to be another victim? Miss Marple walked slowly home, through the drizzling afternoon, her mind working furiously. The photograph of Dorothy and James Pemberton, the newspaper clippings, the lunch conversation between Fairchild and Ashford. All of it painted a picture far more complex than a simple grudge killing. Someone in St. Mary Mead had been living with stolen identity, papers for 30 years. Someone had killed Harold Pemberton and made it look like suicide. And someone had killed Richard Fairchild to prevent the truth from finally coming to light. But most importantly, someone had tried to silence Mrs. Ashford because she knew, too, much about a secret that had been buried for 3 decades. The question now was whether that secret concerned a missing child, missing money, or something even more sinister. As she reached her front gate, Miss Marple noticed a figure watching from across the street. Mr. Weatherby, standing in the shadows of the churchyard, his face pale and drawn. When he saw her looking, he turned and walked quickly away. Miss Marple made a mental note to check whether James Pemberton had ever been found after his mother's death. She suspected the answer would be very illuminating indeed. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Revelation. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to Miss Marple's cottage. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, closely followed by Colonel Smithers, both looking distinctly agitated. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry began without preamble. Inspector Craddock has turned my morning room upside down. He found something behind my late husband's desk, a small key taped underneath one of the drawers. Colonel Smithers harumphed. Damnable business, poor Arthur's. Desk violated like that. What was Richard thinking? Hiding things in other people's homes? Miss Marple invited them in for tea, her mind already working. A key, you say? Did Inspector Craddock indicate what it might unlock? A safety deposit box, apparently, Mrs. Bantry replied, settling into her chair with obvious distress. At the bank where all this trouble started 30 years ago. But here's the peculiar thing. The box isn't registered under Richard's name. Oh, under whose name, then? Colonel Smithers leaned forward. That's just it. It's registered under the name Dorothy Pemberton, but she's been dead for 30 years. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. How very interesting. And I suppose Inspector Craddock will be investigating this box. He's there now, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. But Miss Marple, There's something else. Dr. Meadows came by just before we left. Mrs. Ashford has regained consciousness and is asking to speak with you specifically. With me? How curious. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock. Inspector Craddock entered, looking grim but determined, followed by Dr. Meadows. "Ladies, Colonel," the inspector nodded. "I'm afraid I have disturbing news. The safety deposit box contained documents that shed an entirely new light on this case." He sat heavily, consulting his notebook. Inside were birth certificates, adoption, papers, and a detailed confession written by Dorothy Pemberton shortly before her death. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. A confession. Dorothy Pemberton discovered that her father-in-law had been murdered. She witnessed the killer leaving Harold Pemberton's office that Sunday morning. When she tried to blackmail the murderer, they arranged her death to look like an accident. Colonel Smithers went pale. "Good God! You mean both deaths were murders?" "It appears so. But here's the most shocking part. Dorothy's infant son didn't die with her, as everyone believed. He was secretly placed with a family in a neighbouring village. The adoption papers are all there." Dr. Meadows spoke up quietly. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Ashford specifically requested to speak with you. She says she has something important to tell you about the boy who came home." Miss Marple rose with decision. "Then I believe we should visit her immediately." At the cottage hospital, Mrs. Ashford lay propped against pillows, looking frail but alert. Her eyes fastened on Miss Marple immediately. "Miss Marple, thank goodness you've come. I need to tell you before anyone tries to silence me permanently." Her voice was hoarse but urgent. "I know who killed Harold Pemberton and why." Miss Marple took the chair beside the bed. "Please, take your time. My name isn't Vera Ashford. It's Vera Hartwell. I was Harold Pemberton's housekeeper 35 years ago." She paused, gathering strength. "I saw what happened, but I was too frightened to speak at the time." Inspector Craddock leaned forward intently. "What exactly did you see?" "I saw George Weatherby entering Mr. Pemberton's office that Sunday morning. Harold had discovered George's embezzlement scheme, a clever one that had been running for years. George knew Harold was going to expose him on Monday." The room fell silent. Mrs. Ashford continued, her voice growing stronger. "George killed Harold and staged it as suicide, complete with a confession. But Dorothy had seen George leaving. She tried to use that knowledge to protect little James's future. She demanded money for the child's care in exchange for her silence. And George arranged her death as well," Miss Marple stated quietly. "Yes, made it look like an accident, just as he'd made Harold's death look like suicide. But Dorothy was cleverer than George realized. She'd already placed James with a trusted family, and left all the evidence in that safety deposit box." Colonel Smithers spluttered. "But why didn't you speak up at the time?" Mrs. Ashford's eyes filled with tears. "Because George threatened me too. He knew I'd seen him, and he made it clear that I could disappear just as easily as the others. So I changed my name, became Vera Ashford, and moved to St. Mary Mead to watch over James from a distance." Inspector Craddock's pen had been moving rapidly. "Watch over James? You knew where the child was placed?" "I helped arrange it. The family who took him lived right here in St. Mary Mead. They were told he was an orphan with no living relatives. So, sure, Marple's needles had been clicking steadily, but now they stilled completely. Mrs. Ashford, who was the child placed with? The Hartwell family. They raised him as their own, never knowing his true identity. She looked directly at Miss Marple. The boy grew up to be Timothy Hartwell. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Meadows gripped the back of his chair, and Inspector Craddock's pen clattered to the floor. Timothy Hartwell is James Pemberton? The inspector managed. But that means Clara. Hartwell is Dorothy Pemberton's daughter-in-law, Miss Marple finished thoughtfully, and she's lived in this village her entire married life, probably unaware of the truth about her husband's parentage. Mrs. Ashford nodded weakly. I've watched Timothy grow up, marry Clara, start a family. I've watched George Weatherby rise in the bank, become respectable, trusted, and I've waited 30 years for the right moment to make him pay. But why now? Dr. Meadows asked. What changed? Richard Fairchild. He never stopped investigating. Recently, he'd begun to piece things together. When he approached me at the garden party lunch, he told me he'd found evidence that could prove George's guilt. We arranged to make it look like we were arguing, to deflect suspicion from me. Inspector Craddock picked up his pen. So the public argument was staged. Richard's idea. He thought if people believed I had a grudge against him, they wouldn't suspect me of being his ally. He was going to reveal everything after the party. But George poisoned his tea first, Miss Marple observed. George must have overheard our conversation at lunch. He knew Richard was close to exposing him, and he couldn't risk it. Not when Timothy's position at the bank had put him in a position to potentially discover the same evidence his grandfather had found 30 years ago. The implications were staggering. George Weatherby had killed twice to protect his secret, and now Timothy Hartwell, Harold Pemberton's grandson, was unknowingly working at the same bank where it all began. Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple said gently, you said someone tried to silence you permanently. You believe Mr. Weatherby poisoned you as well? I'm certain of it. He must have realized I knew too much. But he underestimated the dose. Or perhaps he was interrupted. Either way, he'll try again. Inspector Craddock stood abruptly. Then we need to move quickly. Mrs. Ashford, you'll remain under police protection. Dr. Meadows, I'll need you to stay close as well. And we need to warn the Hartwells immediately. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Ashford called out weakly, Miss Marple, there's something else. Something even George doesn't know. Miss Marple returned to the bedside. Dorothy left a letter for James, to be given to him on his 30th birthday. It explains everything. His true parentage, the murders, all of it. That letter is why I stayed, why I watched over him all these years. And when is Timothy's 30th birthday? Mrs. Ashford's smile was grim. Tomorrow. Chapter 7. Another twist, the revelation of Timothy's approaching birthday, cast an urgent pall over their mission. Inspector Craddock immediately dispatched constables to locate both Timothy and Clara Hartwell, while Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of deception that had entangled St. Mary Mead for 3 decades. As they left the hospital, Dr. Meadows pulled Inspector Craddock aside. Inspector, there's something troubling me about Mrs. Ashford's account. If she's been protecting Timothy all these years, why didn't she warn him when she realized the danger was escalating? Perhaps she intended to, Miss Marple suggested gently. After Mr. Fairchild's revelation, but events moved too quickly. They discovered the answer to Dr. Meadows' question when they reached the Hartwell cottage. Clara met them at the door, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling. "Oh, Inspector, thank goodness you're here. Timothy's gone missing. He left this morning after receiving a telephone call, saying he had to meet someone about urgent bank business. He took his briefcase and said he'd be back by evening, but that was 12 hours ago." Inspector Craddock's expression darkened. "Who called him?" "I assumed it was Mr. Weatherby, though the caller didn't give his name." Timothy seemed excited, actually. He said something about finally being able to prove his innocence regarding those missing funds. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed several details that others might have missed. The breakfast dishes still on the table, Timothy's reading glasses left behind when he usually never went anywhere without them, and most telling, a half-finished letter on his desk in his careful handwriting. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said gently, "might I see that letter?" Clara nodded, leading them to Timothy's small study. The letter was addressed to "My dearest Clara," and began with an expression of love and concern for her welfare, but it was the final visible line that made Miss Marple's blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, know that I finally learned the truth about my father's death. Mrs. Hartwell," Inspector Craddock said urgently, "has Timothy recently discovered anything about his adoption?" Clara's eyes widened. "Adoption? I don't understand. Timothy isn't adopted." Dr. Meadows intervened gently. "Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps you should sit down. There are some things about your husband's background that he himself may not have known." And they explained the extraordinary revelations about Timothy's true identity. Clara grew progressively paler. When they finished, she sat in stunned silence for several moments. "Then Timothy he's Harold Pemberton's grandson, the bank manager who supposedly committed suicide?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm afraid so," Inspector Craddock confirmed. "And we believe he may have stumbled upon evidence that proves his grandfather was murdered." Clara suddenly gasped. "The documents!" "Last week, Timothy found a box of old papers in the attic. Our landlord had asked us to clear it out before selling the house. Timothy spent hours going through them, becoming more and more excited about something he'd found." "Did he tell you what it was?" "Only that it concerned his parents' death. I thought he meant the Hartwells, the people who raised him. But now—" She trailed off, understanding dawning. Miss Marple stood abruptly. "Inspector, I believe we need to search Mr. Weatherby's premises immediately. If Timothy confronted him with evidence—" Before Inspector Craddock could respond, the telephone rang. Clara answered with shaking hands, then held it out to the inspector. "It's Mr. Weatherby. He wants to speak with you." Inspector Craddock took the receiver, his jaw set grimly. "Weatherby, where are you?" The conversation was brief, and the inspector's face grew increasingly tense. When he hung up, he turned to the others with a grim expression. "Weatherby claims Timothy came to see him this morning with wild accusations about old bank records. He says Timothy became agitated and left, threatening to go to the police with his fantasy. He's asking why Timothy hasn't come home." "Doctor," Meadows frowned, "that doesn't sound right. If Timothy had evidence, surely he would have gone to the police first, not confronted Weatherby directly." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. unless Timothy didn't realize the full implications of what he'd found. Perhaps he thought he was merely uncovering old irregularities, not evidence of murder. Clara spoke up suddenly. "There's something else. This morning, before the telephone call, Timothy received a letter in the post. Hand-delivered, no postmark. He read it and went very quiet, then locked it in his desk drawer." Inspector Craddock immediately examined the desk. The drawer was indeed locked, but the wood was old and the lock easily forced. Inside they found a single sheet of paper written in a woman's hand. "My dearest James, if you are reading this, then you have reached your 30th birthday, and the time has come for you to learn the truth about your heritage. You are not who you believe yourself to be." The letter was unsigned, but bore yesterday's date. Miss Marple studied it carefully. "This isn't 30 years old," she observed. "This was written recently, in Mrs. Ashford's hand, if I'm not mistaken." Clara looked confused. But why would the postmistress write to Timothy about his birthday? Dr. Meadows and Inspector Craddock exchanged glances. "Mrs. Hartwell," the inspector said gently, "Mrs. Ashford has been protecting your husband his entire life. This letter was meant to warn him." But even as they spoke, Miss Marple felt a growing unease. Something about the day's events didn't align properly in her mind. Timothy's excitement about proving his innocence, his willingness to confront Weatherby alone, the timing of Mrs. Ashford's letter. "Inspector," she said suddenly, "I think we need to consider another possibility. What if Weatherby didn't lure Timothy away? What if Timothy went to confront him of his own accord, believing he had enough evidence to force a confession?" Sekunditur. Implications were chilling. Timothy, armed with partial knowledge and righteous anger, facing a man who had already killed 3 people to protect his secret. "We need to find them," Inspector Craddock declared. "Clara, is there anywhere Timothy might have taken Weatherby? Somewhere private where they could talk without interruption?" Clara thought desperately. "Timothy loves the old mill by Wickham Stream. He goes there to think when he's troubled. He says it's peaceful there, away from everything." The old mill was isolated, surrounded by woods with no near neighbours, perfect for a confrontation, or for disposing of an inconvenient witness. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple caught sight of something that made her pause. On Timothy's desk calendar, tomorrow's date, his 30th birthday, was circled, heavily in red ink. Written beside it in his careful script were the words, "The truth at last." Timothy Hartwell had known exactly what he was walking into. The question now was whether they would find him alive to face that truth, or whether George Weatherby had claimed his 4th victim. As they hurried toward their vehicles, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for Timothy, but for the truth that had been buried for 30 years and was finally clawing its way to the surface. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The old mill stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its broken wheel silent beside the stream that had once powered it. Inspector Craddock signalled for silence as their small convoy approached, but Miss Marple noticed something immediately that made her touch his arm. "Inspector, there are 2 motor cars parked behind the mill, Mr. Weatherby's and another I don't recognise." Dr. Meadows squinted through the gathering dusk. "That's Timothy's car. I've seen it at the surgery." They approached cautiously, leaving Clara in the police vehicle with a constable, despite her protests. As they drew closer, voices could be heard from within the mill, one plaintive and desperate, the other cold and measured. 30 years, George, 30 years you've let people believe my grandfather was a thief and a coward. Timothy's voice carried clearly through a broken window. Your grandfather was a fool who couldn't leave well enough alone. Weatherby's response was chillingly calm. Just as you're being now. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could see through the broken window. Timothy sat tied to a chair in the centre of the mill's main room, his briefcase open on a table, nearby papers scattered around it. Weatherby stood with his back to the window, something glinting in his hand. You know what I find most amusing, Timothy? Weatherby continued conversationally. You've been working under my nose all these years, and I never suspected who you really were. Harold Pemberton's precious grandson, right there in my own bank. You killed them all, Timothy said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. My grandfather, my mother, Richard Fairchild. And now you're going to kill me too. Weatherby chuckled without humour. I didn't plan for you to exist, you know. Dorothy should have died with you in that car. But she was cleverer than I gave her credit for. Hid you away like a secret cache. Inspector Craddock was motioning for his constables to surround the building, but Miss Marple held up a hand for patience. Something about the conversation troubled her deeply. The missing bank funds, Timothy pressed. You've been embezzling for decades, haven't you? Using your position to cover it up. Missing funds? Weatherby laughed genuinely now. Oh, Timothy, you understand so little. There were never any missing funds in the modern sense. What your grandfather discovered was something far more valuable. Miss Marple leaned closer to the window, her mind racing. You see, Weatherby continued, your grandfather wasn't investigating embezzlement. He was investigating something his daughter-in-law had discovered, that I wasn't who I claimed to be. Timothy's confusion was evident. What do you mean? George knew Weatherby died in a climbing accident in Scotland 35 years ago. I simply assumed his identity when I came to work at the bank. A missing person with no close family, perfect banking credentials, and most importantly, no one to contradict the story. The revelation hit Miss Marple like a physical blow. She caught Inspector Craddock's arm and whispered urgently in his ear. His eyes widened, and he nodded grimly. But why? Timothy's voice was barely a whisper. Why kill for someone else's identity? Because the real George Weatherby had something I desperately needed, a clean slate. You see, I had been involved in some rather unsavoury business in London. Nothing that could be proven, of course, but enough to make a fresh start desirable. So you murdered an innocent man to steal his life. I survived, Timothy. That's what matters. Your grandfather and mother threatened that survival, just as Richard Fairchild did, just as you do now. Miss Marple saw Weatherby raise his hand, revealing what she had feared, a small pistol. But instead of acting immediately, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped into view of the window and began to applaud, slowly. Bravo, Mr. Weatherby. Or should I say, Mr. Who exactly are you? Weatherby spun toward the window, his face contorting with shock and rage. Who's there? Miss Jane Marple, she called out pleasantly. as if greeting him at a garden party. "I must say, you've had quite an impressive run. 35 years living another man's life. But I'm afraid you've made one rather significant error. Get away from there," Weatherby shouted, swinging the pistol toward the window. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "The error, my dear man, is in your story. You see, I knew the real George Weatherby." Weatherby's face went white. "That's impossible." "Is it? My nephew married George Weatherby's sister in 1985. I attended the wedding where George served as best man. Lovely young man, bit of a stutter when nervous, had a distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident." Miss Marple stepped closer to the window, her voice carrying with crystal clarity. "You've been very clever, stealing his name, his credentials, even his mannerisms. But you couldn't steal his memories, could you? His family history, his personal quirks." Weatherby was backing away from the window now, the pistol wavering. "You're lying." "Am I? Then perhaps you can tell me about George's favourite climbing route in the Lake District, or his pet name for his sister Margaret, or why he refused to eat lamb?" Each question hit home like a separate blow. Weatherby's composure was cracking. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "None of it matters now." But Miss Marple continued relentlessly. "Oh, but it does matter. You see, the real George Weatherby didn't die in a climbing accident. He emigrated to Australia in 1989. I received a Christmas card from him just last year." The gun in Weatherby's hand began to shake violently. The careful facade he had maintained for 35 years was crumbling before their eyes. "You've been living a dead man's life," Miss Marple concluded gently. "But the dead man isn't quite as dead as you believed." Inspector Craddock chose that moment to signal his constables. The mill's doors burst open simultaneously, but Weatherby was no longer focused on Timothy. He was staring at Miss Marple through the window, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Who are you, really?" "Someone who knew George Weatherby when he was young," Miss Marple replied. "Someone who remembers that he had a heart condition that prevented him from strenuous activity. Someone who wonders how a man with such a condition could have died in a climbing accident." The false Weatherby raised the pistol one final time, but his hand was shaking too badly to aim. Inspector Craddock's voice rang out sharply. "Drop your weapon!" The man who had lived as George Weatherby for 35 years looked around the mill, at Timothy, at the approaching constables, at Miss Marple still visible through the window. Then he smiled sadly and said, "My name is James Morton. I was 19 when I killed the real George Weatherby, because I needed his life more than he did." The pistol clattered to the floor as James Morton, the man who had murdered 4 people to protect a stolen identity, finally surrendered to the truth he had spent over 3 decades trying to hide. Chapter 9. The Full Revelation. In the stunned silence that followed Morton's confession, Inspector Craddock moved swiftly to secure the scene, while Dr. Meadows rushed to examine Timothy. Miss Marple remained by the window, observing how the weight of 35 years seemed to lift from Morton's shoulders even as the handcuffs clicked into place. "Doctor," Timothy called out weakly as Dr. Meadows cut his bonds, "is Mrs. Ashford? Is she safe?" "She's under police protection and recovering." "Well," Dr. Meadows assured him, "thanks largely to Miss Marple's quick thinking. Inspector Craddock approached Morton, who sat slumped in a chair, no longer attempting to maintain the dignified bearing he had cultivated as George Weatherby. "James Morton," the inspector began formally, "you are under arrest for the murders of George Weatherby, Harold Pemberton, Dorothy Pemberton, and Richard Fairchild, as well as the attempted murder of Vera Ashford." Morton nodded slowly. "I suppose you'll want the whole story." "In due time," Inspector Craddock replied. "But first, are there any other victims we should know about?" "No," Morton said quietly. "Just the ones you named. Each death was necessary to preserve what I had built." Miss Marple had entered the mill and now stood regarding Morton with a mixture of understanding and sadness. "Mr. Morton, if I may ask, what was so terrible about your original life that required you to steal another's?" Morton looked up at her, and for a moment the careful mask he had worn for decades fell completely away, revealing a haunted young man beneath the aging exterior. "I was involved with some very dangerous people in London. Drug dealers, money launderers. I wasn't a criminal mastermind, just a foolish boy who got in too deep." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I owed them money I couldn't repay. They made it clear that my life was forfeit unless I could find a way to make it worth their while." "So you found George Weatherby," Timothy interjected, his voice hoarse but steady. "I was working as a clerk at a temporary employment agency. George came in looking for banking work. He'd just finished his qualifications. Bright, eager, no close family except a sister in America. He mentioned he was going climbing alone that weekend in Scotland." Morton's voice grew distant, as if recounting someone else's memory. "I followed him. It was supposed to be just robbery. Take his credentials, his identification, enough money to buy me time with the people I owed. But when I confronted him at the remote cabin he'd rented—" "You killed him," Miss Marple said gently. "He fought back. We struggled. He hit his head on the fireplace. I panicked." Morton's hands trembled. "But then I realized here was my way out. A complete identity, ready-made. I buried his body in the woods and became George Weatherby." Inspector Craddock was taking notes furiously. "And the bank accepted you without question?" "George had excellent credentials, and I'd studied his application thoroughly. I knew enough to pass the initial interviews. The rest I learned as I went along." Clara Hartwell had been allowed into the mill, and now stood beside Timothy, holding his hand tightly. "But why kill my husband's grandfather? Why not just leave when things got difficult?" Morton's face hardened, because Harold Pemberton was too clever for his own good. He'd noticed small discrepancies in the records, nothing that pointed to embezzlement, but patterns that suggested someone had been accessing accounts they shouldn't. He started investigating, and discovered you weren't really George Weatherby, Timothy concluded. Dorothy actually figured it out first. She found a letter George had written to his sister before he died, talking about the banking position. Small details that didn't match what I'd told Harold. She confronted me privately, demanded money for her silence. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "So you arranged Harold's death to look like suicide, implicating him in embezzlement to discredit any suspicions about identity theft. The confession was easy enough to forge once I studied Harold's handwriting, but Dorothy wouldn't let it rest. She kept pushing, even after her father-in-law's death. She knew I'd killed him." "So you killed her too," Dr. Meadows said grimly. "Sabotaged her car. Made it look like an accident. I thought that would be the end of it." Morton's voice cracked slightly. I never meant for there to be so many deaths." Timothy leaned forward painfully. "But you knew about me. You knew I survived." "I suspected Dorothy might have hidden you somewhere, but I couldn't find you. Years passed. I built a life, a career, respectability. I convinced myself the past was truly buried. Until I started working at the bank," Timothy realized. "You were so young when you started, I didn't recognize you. It was only recently, when you began looking into those old files for the audit, that certain features became familiar. The shape of your eyes, the way you moved your hands when thinking, exactly like your grandfather." Miss Marple sat down across from Morton. "And when Mr. Fairchild approached you about his suspicions, Richard had never believed Harold's suicide. He'd kept copies of documents, pursued private investigations over the years. Recently, he'd begun to piece together the truth about the identity theft. When Timothy's researches uncovered more evidence." "You decided they both had to die?" Inspector Craddock finished. Morton nodded miserably. "I thought if I killed Richard and made it look like Mrs. Ashford had done it out of some old grudge, I could maintain my cover, but she knew too much about the real events." "So you tried to silence her permanently," Dr. Meadows added. "A mistake. I should have realized she was protecting Timothy, not threatening him. By the time I understood the truth, it was too late." Miss Marple studied Morton with the same intensity she might apply to a particularly complex knitting pattern. "Mr. Morton, in all these years living as George Weatherby, did you never consider simply disappearing, starting fresh somewhere else? Where would I go? I'd built everything on this foundation: career, reputation, financial security. To abandon it would mean admitting that George Weatherby's life was meaningless." "But it wasn't his life," Timothy said quietly. "It was yours. Built on his death." Morton looked up sharply. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't been haunted by it every single day for 35 years? Every time someone called me George, every time I signed his name, every time I looked in the mirror." Tears were running down his face now, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since his confession. "I became so good at being George Weatherby that I forgot who James Morton was. Until tonight, until Miss Marple forced me to remember. The real tragedy isn't just that I killed 5 people. It's that I've spent 35 years not knowing who I am." The mill fell silent, except for the sound of water flowing past outside. In that silence, Miss Marple reflected on the profound sadness of a life stolen and a life wasted, all for the sake of running from consequences that might have been faced, honestly, so many years ago. Inspector Craddock broke the silence. "Mr. Morton, we'll need a full statement, but first I think Dr. Meadows should examine both you and Mr. Hartwell." As Morton was led away, still handcuffed but somehow seeming smaller and more fragile than before, Miss Marple noticed Timothy staring after him with an expression of complex emotions. "He destroyed so many lives," Timothy said quietly. "Yet I almost feel sorry for him." "That," Miss Marple replied gently, "is what makes you Harold Pemberton's grandson. Compassion, even for those who have wronged us deeply." Chapter 10. Resolution and Reflection. 3 days after James Morton's arrest, St. Mary Mead was still adjusting to the extraordinary revelations that had shattered its peaceful facade. Miss Marple sat in her garden, working on her knitting while observing the subtle changes in the village's rhythm. Mrs. Bantry arrived for their usual morning tea, but her usual cheerfulness was tempered with thoughtfulness. She settled into the garden chair with a heavy sigh. "I still can't quite believe it all," she began, pouring milk into her cup with unusual care. "To think that man lived among us for 8 years, attending church, joining the parish council, even donating to the Christmas fund, all while carrying such terrible secrets." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "People are remarkably adaptable, Mrs. Bantry. We can convince ourselves of many things when survival depends upon it. But 5 murders, Miss Marple, 5! Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "And poor Timothy, learning all that about his family history. How is he managing?" "Better than one might expect, I think. Clara says having the truth, however painful, is preferable to living with uncertainty and false guilt." They were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who had become a frequent visitor since the case's resolution. He accepted Mrs. Bantry's offer of tea gratefully. "I wanted to update you both on the investigation's progress," he began. "Morton, or Weatherby, as we knew him, has been remarkably forthcoming with details. It seems the strain of maintaining his false identity for so many years had taken quite a toll." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Has he explained the recent financial irregularities Timothy was investigating? Ironically, those weren't connected to the murders at all. Timothy had indeed uncovered some minor clerical errors in his own department, nothing criminal, just computational mistakes that accumulated over time. But Morton assumed Timothy was following the same investigative path as his grandfather, which triggered his desperation." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "You mean Richard Fairchild died because of a misunderstanding?" "Partially, yes. Morton's paranoia had grown over the years. He interpreted Timothy's legitimate audit work as a direct threat, especially when Richard began asking questions about the old Pemberton case." Dr. Meadows appeared at the garden gate, accompanied by Timothy and Clara Hartwell. Miss Marple invited them all in, and soon her small garden hosted an impromptu gathering of those most affected by the recent events. Timothy looked healthier than when Miss Marple had last seen him, though the knowledge of his true heritage had clearly left its mark. Clara remained close to his side, her hand often reaching for his. "We wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," Timothy began earnestly. "Dr. Meadows told us how you identified Morton's deception through your knowledge of the real George Weatherby, Monsieur." Marple smiled modestly. "I merely remembered details that seemed significant. The real credit belongs to Mrs. Ashford, or Mrs. Hartwell, as we now know her, for keeping watch over you all these years." "We visited her yesterday," Clara added. "She's eager to tell Timothy stories about his grandparents, his mother, things he never knew." Dr. Meadows accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry. "She's making a remarkable recovery. The psychological relief of finally speaking the truth seems to have been as healing as any medical treatment." Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. "Mrs. Ashford has also been invaluable in helping us piece together the full timeline of events. Apparently, she suspected Morton's true identity years ago, but couldn't prove it without endangering Timothy." "How did she suspect?" Miss Marple inquired. Small inconsistencies in his knowledge of banking procedures from 30 years ago, questions he asked that the real George Weatherby would have known the answers to. She began keeping detailed observations, almost like a dossier. Timothy shifted uncomfortably. It's difficult to accept that my entire life has been watched, protected by someone I barely knew. She didn't know you personally, Miss Marple observed gently, but she knew who you were. Sometimes that kind of love, protective love from a distance, can be the most powerful of all. Mrs. Bantry looked between Timothy and Clara. And what will you do now? Will you change your name? Timothy and Clara exchanged glances. We've discussed it extensively, Clara replied. Timothy has decided to honour both his heritage and the family who raised him. He'll be Timothy Pemberton Hartwell. And at the bank? Inspector Craddock asked. Mr. Denham from the district office has offered me a transfer to the London branch, with a promotion, a fresh start, away from all the painful associations. Timothy paused. Though we've decided to stay in St. Mary Mead for now, this is our home. Dr. Meadows raised his teacup in a small toast. To new beginnings built on truth. As the afternoon progressed and the gathering gradually dispersed, Miss Marple found herself alone with Inspector Craddock. He seemed to have something weighing on his mind. Miss Marple, there's something about this case that continues to puzzle me. How did you know to question Morton's identity so specifically? Your knowledge of the real George Weatherby seemed remarkably detailed. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked directly at the inspector. I'm afraid I wasn't entirely truthful during the confrontation, Inspector. His eyebrows rose in surprise. I never actually met George Weatherby, nor did my nephew marry his sister. But I had heard enough about him from Mrs. Ashford over the years, small details she mentioned when speaking carefully about the past, to construct a convincing portrait. Inspector Craddock stared at her. You mean you bluffed, observed that Morton had managed to fool everyone for 35 years by assuming someone else's identity perfectly. But there's one thing you cannot steal from a person, their deepest personal connections and memories. I gambled that Morton wouldn't have those intimate details about a man whose life he'd stolen. But the climbing accident not being real. Mrs. Ashford had mentioned once that the suicide note from Harold Pemberton contained a phrase he would never have used, something about scaling new heights. She thought it odd for a man who was reportedly afraid of heights. I simply extrapolated. Inspector Craddock shook his head admiringly. You constructed an entire false narrative to force the truth from him. Sometimes, Miss Marple replied, the most effective way to expose a lie is with a carefully crafted story that forces the liar to confront reality. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the garden. There's one more thing that intrigues me, Inspector Craddock said finally. Morton could have left St. Mary Mead at any time over the past 8 years. Why stay? Miss Marple considered this. I think, Inspector, that after 35 years of living George Weatherby's life, this village had become the closest thing to home he'd ever known. Ironic, isn't it? A man who spent decades running from his past found peace in a place where his greatest secret was gradually being uncovered. Almost as if he wanted to be caught. Perhaps he did. The burden of being someone else for so long. Sometimes the truth, however painful, becomes preferable to the exhaustion of perpetual deception. As Inspector Craddock prepared to leave, he paused at the garden gate. "Thank you, Miss Marple, not just for solving this case, but for showing me that sometimes the most complex mysteries require the simplest human insights." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, reflecting on how a peaceful village garden party had unravelled secrets buried for 3 decades. In her experience, the past had a way of demanding acknowledgement, no matter how carefully it was hidden. The truth, she had learned long ago, was like a plant growing in a dark place. It would always find a way toward the light. Chapter 11. The Return to Peace. 2 weeks later, St. Mary Mead had settled into a new rhythm, like a pond that has absorbed the ripples of a thrown stone and found its calm surface again. Miss Marple sat in the front pew of St. Mary's Church, attending a special memorial service that the village had organised to honour the memories of Harold Pemberton, Dorothy Pemberton, and Richard Fairchild. The afternoon sun streamed through, the stained-glass windows casting colourful patterns across the assembled villagers. Timothy and Clara sat in the front row, Timothy holding a photograph of his grandparents that Mrs. Ashford had given him. Beside them sat Mrs. Ashford herself. She had asked everyone to call her Mrs. Hartwell now, reclaiming her true name after 35 years. Reverend Patterson delivered a thoughtful sermon about truth, forgiveness, and the courage required to face difficult realities. As he spoke, Miss Marple noticed how the congregation had unconsciously arranged itself differently than usual. The survivors of the recent events seemed to have drawn together, forming a small community within the larger one. Dr. Meadows sat with Colonel Smithers and Mrs. Bantry, the 3 having grown closer through their shared experience. Inspector Craddock, who had become something of a fixture in the village, sat toward the back, his presence a reassuring reminder that justice had been served. After the service, the congregation gathered in the churchyard for the unveiling of a small memorial stone. Timothy stepped forward, his voice steady but emotional as he read the inscription, "In memory of Harold Pemberton, Dorothy Pemberton, and Richard Fairchild, whose pursuit of truth honoured them all." Mrs. Ashford approached the stone and placed a small bouquet of white roses at its base. "For James," she whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet air, "the little boy who grew up to be a good man, despite everything." As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking with Mrs. Bantry toward home. The weight of recent events seemed to have settled into a manageable sadness, the kind that comes with acceptance rather than denial. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Bantry said as they paused at Miss Marple's garden gate, "about how we live alongside people for years without really knowing them. George Weatherby or James Morton came to my dinner parties, helped organise village events, even read lessons in church, yet none of us suspected." Miss Marple unlocked her gate thoughtfully. "Perhaps that says something about the nature of secrets, Mrs. Bantry. The harder someone works to appear normal, the more they stand out to those who are watching carefully." "Is that how you knew? That he was trying too hard?" "Partly, but mostly it was the small things. His hesitation when speaking about banking procedures from the past, the way he avoided certain topics without seeming to, how he always deflected personal questions about his early career. I didn't know what it meant at first, but the pattern was there." Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly, And poor Mrs. Ashford, carrying that burden all these years. She found purpose in it, I think. Sometimes protecting others gives meaning to our own sufferings. They were interrupted by the arrival of Timothy and Clara, accompanied by Dr. Meadows. Timothy carried a manila envelope, his expression suggesting important news. "Miss Marple," he began, "we've just come from the solicitor's office. There's something we wanted to share with you." Clara smiled encouragingly as Timothy opened the envelope. "It seems my grandfather anticipated the possibility that the truth about his death might eventually come to light. He left very specific instructions with his solicitor." Timothy withdrew a sealed letter and several official documents. He established a trust fund to be activated if his death was ever proved, to be murder rather than suicide. The fund was designed to benefit the village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows in surprise. "How extraordinary!" Dr. Meadows nodded enthusiastically. "The fund is quite substantial, enough to renovate the village hall, update the medical clinic, and establish a permanent fund for local charities. But there's more," Clara added. "Harold Pemberton also left instructions that if his grandson was ever found, he should have the opportunity to decide how the fund is used." Timothy looked at Miss Marple directly. "Timothy Pemberton Hartwell has decided that the first project should be a community garden, designed and maintained by the villagers themselves. A place where people can work together, share stories, and build genuine connections." "How perfectly appropriate," Miss Marple murmured. "Your grandfather would be proud." As if summoned by the mention of community, Mrs. Ashford appeared, walking slowly but steadily down the lane. She had been staying with the Hartwells while recovering, and the change in her demeanour was remarkable. Free from the burden of her long-held secrets, she seemed to have shed years along with her false identity. "I heard the news about the trust fund," she said, joining their group. Harold was always thinking ahead, always trying to leave the world a little better than he found it. Timothy embraced her gently. "Aunt Vera, if I may call you that, would you help me design this garden? You knew my grandparents better than anyone." The title clearly moved her. "I would be honoured." As evening approached and the small gathering prepared to disperse, Inspector Craddock arrived with one final piece of news. "I thought you'd all want to know," he announced, "that we've located the real George Weatherby in Australia. He's been informed about what happened and is planning to return to England for the trial. Apparently, he has no ill feelings toward Morton. He says he's grateful to be alive and curious to meet the man who lived his life." Dr. Meadows shook his head in wonder. "The real George Weatherby wants to meet the man who stole his identity. He says he wants to understand what drove someone to such desperate measures. Remarkable man, actually. He mentioned that his heart condition was never as serious as the doctors originally thought. It's improved significantly over the years. He probably could have gone climbing after all." Miss Marple smiled at the irony. So Morton created an elaborate lie based on a misunderstood truth. As the others departed, Miss Marple retired to her sitting room with a cup of tea and her knitting. The case of the garden party murder was closed. Justice had been served, and the village was healing. Yet she found herself thinking about James. Morton, sitting in a cell awaiting trial, finally forced to confront the identity he had abandoned so many years ago. She wondered if, in some strange way, he might find peace in that confrontation. For 35 years he had been neither James Morton nor George Weatherby, but someone caught between two lives, belonging fully to neither. Outside her window, the village of St. Mary Mead was settling into its evening routine. Lights came on in cottages, people walked their dogs, children played in gardens. It was a picture of ordinary, peaceful life, the kind of life that Harold Pemberton, Dorothy Pemberton, and Richard Fairchild had all fought to protect through their pursuit of truth. Miss Marple set down her knitting and picked up a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from her great-nephew, telling her about his latest adventures in London. Life, she reflected, went on. New stories began, even as old ones found their resolution. She thought of the community garden that would soon grace St. Mary Mead, a place where truth could grow naturally in the sunlight, nurtured by honest work and genuine connection. It seemed a fitting memorial to the victims and perhaps, in time, a symbol of hope for the perpetrator as well. The mysterious crime at the garden party had been solved, but the garden that would grow from its resolution would bloom for generations to come. In Miss Marple's experience, that was often how justice worked best, not just as punishment for wrongdoing, but as transformation towards something better. As the last light faded from the sky, Miss Marple closed her eyes and allowed herself a small smile. Truth, like the patient gardener, always found a way to cultivate beauty from the darkest soil.